your friends with your endless knowledge about Texas reptiles? Does playing with the mud sound like a great time? How about analyzing tree cookies? Team problem solving? Come join us for an informational meeting about Envirothon, an up-and-coming competition team in its second year at CTHS. Today, after school, in Mrs. Williamson's room, 804. Everyone is welcome. Tuesday, January 12th at City View Lanes Bowling Alley at 5:30, the Chisholm Trail High School bowling team will be having their first game against Boswell. Come support our team. This is Miranda. This is Sam. What is it? Thursday. Happy Thursday.
All right, kids. The flow of today is going to be somewhat similar to yesterday. I'm going to start off by giving you about 10 minutes, maybe not even that much because it's short, to, if you haven't already, read over the AMSCO pages over the Haitian Revolution and put together your own cause and effect chart. 10-ish minutes, probably a little shy of that, because like I said, the Haitian Revolution, as far as what's in the book, it's about a page. It's not much. So use that time to get your chart kind of put together. If you're already done with that, if you go under tomorrow's date, the last link is to your semester exam review. Start looking that over if you are done with the Haitian Revolution stuff, because we are going to introduce the exam review today at the end of class and hopefully give you some time to work on it. Anyway, once this 10 minutes or so has gone on, we will do the same thing as yesterday. I'm going to put up my own version of the chart. We can kind of compare what I got with what you got. There's probably going to be a little bit to add, but not much. We've got a short video, a crash course over the Haitian Revolution, which is going to pepper in all sorts of good details. And then we are done with new material until next semester. Towards the end of class, I am going to show you the semester exam review that is available to you. We'll go over how it's going to be graded, what all it's for, and when it's due towards the end of class. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you the whole day to either work on your semester exam review, or probably more importantly, if you do not have your notebook check all squared away, or even if you plan on doing the extra credit and you don't have that done, I'm going to give you tomorrow to kind of do one of those things. Again, the extra credit, the notebook check, those are more pressing issues than the semester exam review at this point. So if you need to do those things, that would be probably the best for you to spend your time on. Also, for some crazy reason you haven't turned in your first notebook check, again, we need to get those things in. The notebooks do have a very tremendous impact on your grade. Next week, Monday and Tuesday, we'll do some stuff as a whole group to kind of get you ready for the semester exam. You may have a little bit of time to work on a review, but I cannot guarantee that. Definitely not on Monday. We're doing something, kind of a whole class review on Monday. I'm still debating on Tuesday. Your actual semester exam in this class is going to be next Thursday. It is 47 questions, multiple choice. I think you have 76 minutes or something crazy like that. The big difference is, whereas previously we have taken our exams in Canvas, this one is going to be like probably most of your other classes. You're going to log into Eduphoria through your SSO. You're going to take it directly in Eduphoria in Aware. We'll get more into the particulars of that later on, but do know that it's going to be in Aware this time. It is not going to be actually on the Canvas page, although we'll have some links and stuff for you to get there. I think that's about it. Any questions about today or next week or anything? Good stuff. All right, let's say 10-ish minutes. Let's say 9 minutes. At 10:15, we're going to get back together. Hopefully by then you've read through the little bit of information on the Haitian Revolution and have some semblance of a chart developed. That way you can kind of compare and add to it when we go over my chart. If you're already done with everything, which some of you might be, start looking over your semester exam review. Check back in here in about 9-ish minutes. I figured by now you've probably done at least. So much like yesterday, I'm going to show you my version. Add on as you see fit. Again, you do not have to have every single thing that I do, but know that at some point early next semester, when we finish the Latin American revolutions, we are going to have like a political revolutions enlightenment style SAQ, and the more specific evidence or information you have to kind of write about, better off your students. So you don't got to copy everything, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to get as much as you can. You may have some of this. You should have a lot of this. Some of it you probably don't have because there's a couple things that they don't really get into in the book. We're going to go through this, but keep in mind on all these charts, we're not putting in every single detail. We're going to watch the crash course after this, and it goes into a lot more detail that we're leaving out. It's okay. We're just trying to get a good overview. Why did this political revolution take place? And, what were some of the ramifications of it? So give me 1 second. Let me make sure I got everything squared away for my Teams call. Yeah, I think I do. Okay. So let's talk about this. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. I think out of all the political revolutions we've discussed that we're going to discuss, this one is the most justified. Whereas a lot of our other revolutions just have to do with, political independence or protesting unjust taxation. This is essentially one of history's largest slave revolts in history. So you literally have people fighting for their most basic of human freedoms, freedom itself, freedom from bondage. And in that, I think that this revolution does kind of stand alone. There are some similarities, especially in the causes with some of our other political revolutions. But I think, this revolution does stand apart in many respects just by, how justifiable it truly was. So the causes. Cause number one should sound familiar by now, the Enlightenment. Again, that is the philosophical backdrop, 1700s, 1800s. A lot of writers, a lot of people talking about representative government, talking about popular sovereignty, talking about, limits to the power of government, talking about some real basic guaranteed unalienable rights, many of which that, most countries, most nations hadn't really given to their people or guaranteed to their people. So the Enlightenment kind of spurs pretty much all the political revolutions we're going to be talking about during this period. Definitely remember that is a root cause of just about everything. Next, you've got the influence of the American Revolution. The 13 colonies of Great Britain were the first colonies to rebel against their European mother country and actually form a nation of their own. Okay, that's very impactful, especially to other colonized peoples, especially in the New World, that would like to do the same. Again, no one wants to be ruled over by a foreign power, especially after, 100 some odd years of what they would probably deem exploitation. So, the American Revolution, it's what kicks the first domino over, especially in the Americas, especially in these colonized territories. People saw us have some relative success, and they emulated that. A lot of the Haitian Revolution is also connected, though, to the French Revolution. We talked about the very chaotic and just insane French Revolution yesterday. Well, Haiti was a colony of France. So while France is dealing with its own stuff at home, its own internal revolution, it was kind of difficult for them to maintain full control of the colonies they had overseas. Well, Haiti took advantage of that instability and ultimately, launched a successful rebellion. But there was also the issue surrounding the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now, we talked about this yesterday briefly. This was put into place by the first, kind of constitutional monarchy that replaced the absolute monarchy at the beginning of the French Revolution. But this was a document that just guaranteed some basic civil liberties to the people. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, some real basic stuff that everyone should have. To abolish feudalism, and it talked a lot about equality. Now, it did not expressly abolish slavery, but because of some of the language, rumors started to circulate that it did. that the French king under this new regime had actually, outlawed slavery. Well, in the Caribbean, in the land of Haiti, a lot of enslaved Africans. Um, really in the Caribbean, because that was the first area that the Europeans started showing up, a lot of the natives, most of the natives died. They died of European diseases. Then later on, when the transatlantic slave trade started, a lot of these islands started producing sugarcane because the environment, the climate was ideal for that. Haiti's bread and butter at this time. It wasn't even called Haiti back then. It was Saint Domingue. It was on the island of Hispaniola, sharing part of the island with another colony, a Spanish colony. Today, you have two countries still there, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But on the French side, the Haitian side, sugarcane was the name of the game. And because of that, most people on the island were enslaved persons. You start to see the Enlightenment ideals and the revolutionary fervor and the instability in France and the fact that people were really trying to stand up for their dignity. And essentially, what it boils down to is slaves started to revolt. Escaped slaves, called Maroons, good vocab there, rebelled against French colonists under the leadership of a guy, you need to know this person's name, Toussaint Louverture, kind of the architect of the early days of this revolution. A former enslaved person himself. Very, very intelligent, strategically individual. So the revolution's underway, and it goes through some different phases. These are the broadest effects, though. One, Louverture produced a new constitution which abolished slavery, granted equality to all citizens. He declared complete independence and enacted land reform, splitting up some of the old plantation territory amongst the citizens of the island. Louverture took advantage of French involvement in wars with the other European nations, playing various French, Spanish, and British forces against each other. Remember, France is still going through their own revolution. They're fighting a bunch of their neighbors. Well, Louverture took advantage of all that. Napoleon eventually sends French troops when he takes over. Again, Haiti is a big money maker, and he needs that money. Louverture is eventually captured and imprisoned, and his successor, who you read about, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, ends up taking over, and he continues the independence movement. The French send their troops because they want to take their colony back, but they encounter some difficulty, mainly in the form of yellow fever. Okay, this is a tropical disease spread by mosquitoes. And kind of the irony is, whereas Europeans brought over diseases that wiped out a lot of the Native Americans, when the French came to the Caribbean, diseases do impact them as well. And it gets so bad, and because Napoleon's got so much going on at home, eventually he decides to wash his hands of the situation. Even though Haiti's really valuable, it's too much time, it's too much effort. I mean, he's got the continent of Europe to conquer. So he decides, and this ties to a bunch of stuff, that, you know what? I'm going to just wash my hands of the Americas altogether. The main areas that the French still have, well, they become the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon sells Thomas Jefferson, the United States president at the time, a lot of the interior of the Midwestern part of the United States. You'll see it on a map here in a minute. A lot of land ends up being 13 states worth of land for $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. So because of the French Revolution, because of the Haitian Revolution, man, the very infant United States pretty much doubles in size. So again, it's all very much interconnected. And at the end of this whole thing, independence is established. Haiti becomes the first independent nation, modern nation in Latin America. Before any of these other countries that exist today, it's Haiti in Latin America that becomes their independent nation first. This would go down as one of, if not the most successful slave revolt in history. And as far as modern nations are concerned, Haiti will become the first black-led nation. That all kind of gets solidified in 1804. So that's the bare bones. That's the gist of it. and the fact that, now you've got Haiti as an independent Latin American nation, guys, other areas are going to follow suit. Rebellion breeds further rebellion. Revolution breeds further revolution in areas that want those things as well, that want to be self-governing as well. After the break, we'll talk about other revolutions in places like Mexico and Central America and South America. But again, all these revolutions kind of are inspired by each other, fought for a lot of the same ideas. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to watch our one video of the day, Crash Course, Haitian Revolution. As always, especially with Crash Course, it's going to get very detailed. Again, this is the bare bones. It's more complicated. It always is. Don't get overwhelmed by that. Don't try to add a whole bunch unless you just really want to your chart. Main thing is to pay attention, compare what you've read, what you've written with some of the information he's adding on, and hopefully just try to deepen your understanding of this event. Once this is done, we'll look at the semester exam review. I'll tell you a little bit about it. And then we'll be done for the day. And you can work on the review or whatever else you need to do. So pay attention, stay awake, and enjoy our last Crash Course of the semester.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and apparently it's Revolutions Month here at Crash Course, because today we are going to discuss the often neglected Haitian Revolutions. The Haitian Revolutions are totally fascinating, and they involve two of my very favorite things. One, ending slavery, and two, Napoleon getting his feelings hurt. I can't help myself, Napoleon. I like to see you suffer. So the French colony in Saint-Domingue began in the 17th century as a pirate outpost. And its original French inhabitants made their living selling leather and a kind of smoked beef called boucan. All that beef actually came from cattle left behind by the Spanish, who were the first Europeans to settle the island. But anyway, after 1640, the boucan settlers started to run low on beef. And they were like, you know what would pay better than selling beef jerky? Robbing Spanish galleons, which, as you'll recall, were loaded with silver mined from South America. So by the middle of the 17th century, the French had convinced many of those buccaneering captains to give up their pirating and settle on the island. Many of them invested some of their pirate treasure in sugar plantations, which by 1700 were thriving at both producing sugar and working people to death. And soon, this island was the most valuable colony in the West Indies and possibly in the world. It produced 40% of Europe's sugar, 60% of its coffee, and it was home to more slaves than any place except Brazil. And as you'll recall from our discussion of Atlantic slavery, being a slave in a sugar production colony was exceptionally brutal. In fact, by the late 18th century, more slaves were imported to Saint-Domingue every year, more than 40,000, than the entire white population of the island. By the 19th century, slaves made up about 90% of the population, and most of those slaves were African-born because the brutal living and working conditions prevented natural population growth. Like, remember Alfred Crosby's fantastic line, "It is crudely true that if man's caloric intake is sufficient, he will somehow stagger to maturity and he will reproduce?" Yeah, well, not in 18th century Haiti, thanks to yellow fever and smallpox and just miserable working conditions. So most of these plantations were pretty large. They often had more than 200 slaves, and many of the field workers, in some cases the majority, were women. Colonial society in Saint-Domingue was divided into 4 groups, which had important consequences for the revolution. At the top were the big white planters who owned the plantations and all the slaves. Often these Grands Blancs were absentee landlords who would just rather stay in France and let their agents do, the actual brutality. Below them were the wealthy free people of color. Most of the Frenchmen who came to the island were, men, and they frequently fathered children with slave women. These fathers would often free their children. Wasn't that generous of them. So by 1789, there were 24,800 free people of color, along with about 30,000 white people in the colony. The free people of color contributed a lot to the island's stability. They served in the militia and in the local constabulary, and many of the wealthier ones eventually owned plantations and slaves of their own. And then below them on the social ladder were the poor whites, or the petite blancs, who worked as artisans and laborers. And at the bottom were the slaves, who made up the overwhelming majority. I know what you're thinking. This is a recipe for permanent social stability. No, it wasn't. Okay, so when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, all these groups had something to complain about. The slaves obviously disliked being slaves. The free people of color were still subject to legal discrimination no matter how wealthy they became. And the poor whites, in addition to being poor, were resentful of all the privileges held by the wealthy people of color. And the Grands Blancs were complaining about French trade laws and the government's attempts to slightly improve the living and working conditions of slaves. Basically, they were saying that government shouldn't be in the business of regulating business. So everyone was unhappy, but the slaves were by far the worst off. Mr. Green, you're always saying how much slavery sucks, but is it really any worse than having to work for like subsistence. Yeah, I'm going to stop you right there, Mr. LePass, before you further embarrass yourself. You often hear from people attempting to comprehend the horrors of slavery that slavery couldn't have been all that bad, and that it wasn't that different from working for minimum wage. And that we know this because if it had been so bad, slaves would have just revolted, which they never did. Yeah, well, one, equating slavery to poor working conditions ignores the fact that if you work at like Foxconn, Foxconn doesn't get to sell your children to other corporations. And two, as you're about to see, slaves did revolt. So the unrest in what became Haiti started in 1789 when some slaves heard a rumor that the King of France had freed them. Even though it was across the ocean, word of the changes in France reached the people of Haiti, where the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, while terrifying to planters, gave hope both to free people of color and to slaves. At the same time, some Petit Blancs argued that there was inadequate discrimination against blacks. They identified with the Third Estate in France, and they called for interest rates to be lowered so they could more easily pay their debts, and they began lobbying for colonial independence. The psychology here shows you the extent to which slaves were not considered people. I mean, these radical Petit Blancs thought that they were the oppressed people in San Domingo because they couldn't afford to own slaves. And they thought if they could become independent from France, they could take power from the people of privilege and institute a democracy where everyone had a voice, except for the 95% of people who weren't white. Then in 1791, these radical Petit Blancs seized the city of Port-au-Prince. You'll remember that by 1791, France was at war with most of Europe. And just like with the 7 Years' War, the wars of revolutionary France played out in the colonies as well as at home. So the French government sent troops to San Domingo. Meanwhile, urges toward liberty, fraternity, and equality were only growing in France, and it didn't seem very equitable to grant citizenship based solely on race. So in May of 1791, the National Assembly gave full French citizenship to all free men of color. I mean, if they owned property and had enough money and weren't the children of slaves. The Petit Blancs weren't thrilled about this, and that led to fighting breaking out between them and the newly French free people of color. And then in August of 1791, the slaves were like, hi, yes, screw all of you. And a massive slave revolt broke out. Among the leaders of this revolt was Toussaint Breda, a former slave of full African descent who later took the name Toussaint Louverture. Louverture helped mold the slaves into a disciplined army that could withstand attacks from the French troops. But again, the context of the wider revolution proves really important here. So the Spanish had consistently supported revolt in San Domingo, hoping to weaken the French, but by 1793 they were offering even more support. In fact, Louverture became an officer in the Spanish military because the emancipation of the slaves was more important to him than maintaining his rights as a French citizen. So then in October of 1793, the British, whom as I'm sure you'll recall were also at war with France, decided to invade San Domingo. And at that point the French military commanders were like, we are definitely going to lose this war if we fight the British, the Spanish, and the slaves, so let's free the slaves. So they issued decrees freeing the slaves, and on February 4th, 1794, the National Convention in Paris ratified those decrees. By May, having learned of the convention's actions, Louverture switched allegiances to the French and turned the tide of the war. Thus, the most successful slave revolt in human history won freedom and citizenship for every slave in the French Caribbean. But emancipation didn't end the story because the French were still at war with the Spanish and the English in San Domingo. Luckily for France, Louverture was an excellent general, and luckily for the people of the island, Louverture was also an able politician, and between 1794 and 1802, he successfully steered the colony toward independence. So although slavery was abolished, this didn't end the plantation system, because both Louverture and his compatriot Andre Rigaud believed that sugar was vital to the economic health of the island. But now at least people were paid for their labor and their kids couldn't be sold. Now you can compare it to Foxconn. But soon Louverture and Rigaud came into conflict over Rigaud's refusal to give up control over one of the southern states on the island, and there was a civil war, which Louverture, with the help of his able lieutenant Jacques Dessalines, was able to win after 13 months of hard fighting. Louverture then passed a new constitution, and things were going pretty well on San Domingo, with the small problem that it was still technically part of France, which meant that it was about to be ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte. Let's go to the thought bubble. So in 1799, Napoleon seized power in France in a coup, and his new regime, called the Consulate, because he was the first consul, a la the Roman Republic, established a new constitution that specifically pointed out its laws did not apply to France's overseas colonies. Napoleon had plans to reconstruct France's empire in North America that it had lost most of during the 7 Years' War, and to do this, he needed tons of money from France's most valuable colony, San Domingo. And the best way to maximize profits? Why, to reintroduce slavery, of course. That's certainly what the former slaves thought was the plan when in 1802, a French expedition commanded by Napoleon's brother-in-law, Charles Victor Emmanuel I have too many names Leclerc, showed up in San Domingo. This started the second phase of the Haitian Revolution, the fight for independence. So eventually had Louverture arrested and shipped to France, where he died in prison in 1803. But this itself did not spark an uprising against the French, because Louverture wasn't actually that popular, largely because he wanted most blacks on the island to continue to grow sugar. Instead, the former slaves only started fighting when Leclerc tried to take away their guns, thus beginning a guerrilla war that the French, despite their superior training and weapons, had absolutely no chance of winning. Although the French were exceedingly cruel, executing women as well as men and importing man-eating dogs from Cuba, the Haitians had the best ally of all, disease, specifically in the form of yellow fever, which killed thousands of French soldiers, including Leclerc himself. Oh, it's time for the open letter? Dad, where is my chair? Dan, you're telling me the yellow chair has been lost? The yellow chair is the star of the show. The stars in order are 1 me, 2 yellow chair, 3 the chalkboard, 4 Danica, 5 Meredith the intern, 6 you, Stan. You're 6! Oh, Matt, let's do it in the secret compartment today. Not the giant Squidamaker! I am a giant Squidamaker! Oh no, it broke. An open letter to disease. Dear disease, why do you always put yourself at the center of human history? Most of you are just tiny little single-celled organisms, but you're so self-important and self-involved that you're always interfering with us. Admittedly, sometimes you work for the good guys, but usually you don't. It seems like even though you're constantly interfering with human history, you don't even care about it. People, and also microbes, are super self-involved. Like, don't tell me you gotta take a day off to go to your mom's birthday party, Stan. That's not imagining me complexly. I've got needs over here. Best wishes, John Green. So continued defeat and the death of his troops eventually convinced Napoleon to give up his dreams of an American empire and cut his losses. He recalled all his surviving troops. Of the 40,000 who left, only 8,000 made it back, and then he sold Thomas Jefferson Louisiana. And that is how former slaves in Haiti gave America all of this. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines, who had defeated the French, declared the island of San Domingue independent and renamed it Haiti, which is what the island had been called by native inhabitants before the arrival of Columbus. The Haitian Declaration of Independence was a rejection of France and to a certain degree of European racism and colonialism. It also affirmed, to quote from the book Slave Revolution in the Caribbean, a broad definition of the new country as a refuge for enslaved peoples of all kinds. So why is this little island so important that we would devote an entire episode to it? First, Haiti was the second free and independent nation state in the Americas. It also had one of the most successful slave revolts ever. Haiti became the first modern nation to be governed by people of African descent, and they also foiled Napoleon's attempts to build a big New World empire. Of course, Haiti's history since its revolution has been marred by tragedy, a legacy of the loss of life that accompanied the revolution. I mean, 150,000 people died in 1802 and 1803 alone. But the Haitian revolutions matter. They matter because the Haitians, more than any other people in the age of revolutions, stood up for the idea that none should be slaves, that the people who most need the protection of a government should be afforded that protection. Haiti stood up for the weak when the rest of the world failed to. The next time you read about Haiti's poverty, remember that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
All right, so that is it for new material for the time being. Last thing, and then it's kind of up to you where we go from here. I want to show you your exam review, semester exam review. So if you go down to Friday, to tomorrow's date, you're going to see a few different things already in there. You've got the link to turn in your notebook check. Again, that's due before midnight. You've got your extra credit link that is also due before midnight. Then you're going to see the actual file of this semester exam review. The link to turn it in, along with another copy of that file, is already open under Next Friday. So whenever you get it done, certainly you can get that in, but I probably wouldn't turn it in until the day of your exam. So this is kind of what it looks like. And it's relatively lengthy, but it's really not that bad. A lot of this stuff I'm hoping you can do off the top of your head. Semester exam review. This is going to be due next Friday by 1:05 p.m., by the end of the day, because that is when the semester officially ends. I want you to get it done, obviously, before you take the test. But it's too hard for me to kind of stagger out due dates amongst all my classes. So we're just going to make it due for everybody by the end of the school day on Friday, next Friday. But again, get it done early. Obviously, you want to get this done before you do your test. First part is all vocabulary. Just need some basic definitions. Some of this stuff you know off the top of your head. Some of the stuff you may have to look up. Part 2 is all charts. First, I have picked out some of the civilizations we've discussed. These civilizations were picked up because they're probably referenced in some way, shape, or form on the exam. What I need from you over each is just a description of where they were located, their geographic area of control, and then tell me 3 things about them. They can be any 3 things. The hope is if you got to look back over your notes and kind of figure out what these groups are all about, hopefully that'll help jog your memory as to some things that you may need to know. The next chart, belief systems. I've got some of the belief systems, the religions that we've talked about, very similar in requirements. Give me their areas of influence. Where were they most heavily practiced? Where they spread to? Where they have the biggest impact? And then give me, again, 3 of their basic characteristics. Last one, trade networks. We got the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean, Trans-Saharan trade, transatlantic trade. I want to know what areas were connected. And give me 3 of the trade goods or 3 of the things that were diffused along those trade routes. This is not going to go on this 6 weeks. The reason is I don't want to throw any sort of wrench in at the very, very end. This is going to be your first grade of the next 6 weeks. That being said, it is technically due this semester because it's due next Friday. To encourage you to get this done, and frankly, while it's going to take you a while, it's not hard. I'm making this double weighted, meaning that it's not worth 1 daily grade. It's essentially worth the equivalent of 2 daily grades, even though you only see 1 thing in Skyward. So if you don't do it, it's going to have as much impact as 2 zeros would. But if you get it done and you do it well, it's going to have as much impact as 2 hundreds. You are going to have... Well, we don't have much time left today, but you're going to have tomorrow to work on it. You might have a little bit of class time next week. Monday, we're doing something all together. Tuesday, I'm still figuring things out. Wednesday is going to be study hall, so you'll definitely have time then if you so choose. And then your actual test is next Thursday. But again, this isn't actually due until Friday before you leave. Pretty much it. Pretty straightforward. Any questions about what's going on over the next several days? Okay. Well, we only got 7 minutes left, so I'm not going to say you got to get started on this right now. You certainly can if you want to. There are a few weird terms on here, things that we don't expressly teach in this class, like birth rate, mortality rate. Those are things you probably went over last year. We'll talk about them next week, don't worry. But most of this stuff is just some basic vocabulary that probably shows up on the exam. Or if you know this vocabulary, you can figure out some stuff on these. Again, I didn't just pick stuff at random. I picked stuff that I felt would be most beneficial for you to kind of wrap your head around getting ready for the test. But we are done for the day. Use the next 5-6 minutes however you see most productively. And if you need anything, obviously let me know.